Hi, welcome everyone to our podcast today. And we have a very special guest, Evan Klein. Evan is a BCBA, and he works in a specific realm of healthcare called ABA. Now, Evan, if you can just tell us a little bit more about what you do and maybe a little bit more about ABA, I think like a lot of our listeners would love to hear that.
Yeah, so ABA is a applied behavior analysis that focuses on therapies for children with various developmental disabilities. The most common one being autism, because autism is the most common developmental disability we see. So we work on various strategies to increase communication, social skills for children on the spectrum or with various disabilities, as well as reducing behavioral excesses that might be present in these kids. Kind of all around treatment to help get them on a regular track so they can get them on a more regular track so they can succeed more independently in their lives.
That makes a lot of sense. What drew you to ABA?
Yeah, so I started off just in psychology, getting my bachelor's in that. I was always interested in the mind and really studying the brain in general. So I ended up in ABA because a friend of mine started working in the field and said how much he liked it. So I kind of stumbled into it myself and just ended up really falling in love with it and working with the kids and really having any problem a parent throws at you or that you can see and just being able to tackle it and using a lot of problem solving skills to get these kids to the place they're supposed to be to communicating appropriately and interacting with their peers appropriately too. So it's a very fulfilling field for me.
Yeah, that does sound very fulfilling. What's part for me is, or interesting for me to talking to you is that I just don't know a whole lot about ABA, and I think a lot of folks out there probably have a little misconceptions or just don't really understand. Well, one of the misconceptions is like the tantrums that you hear that kids have or a meltdown, and a core principle of your work is that all behavior has a function. How does understanding that completely change the way a parent views an autistic meltdown versus a standard childhood tantrum?
Yeah. So the big difference there, obviously, between a standard child having their behavior is they can understand more of a parent talking at them and the consequences and what's right or wrong. But a child with autism might have communication or social deficits where that might not click with them. So they learn by experience and consequences and things being put into place so that they can learn in those real moments. So when we break down those big behaviors to these functions, we can categorize them and then kind of know exactly how to respond to it so we can exactly understand what they're trying to communicate with us. That's really what the functions do is when this child's having this huge meltdown, we have to think, what does he want? What is he trying to tell me? What is he trying to show me? And we figure out how to guide him towards the appropriate way to say that. So the most common for tantrums being denied access to things. So we can go with screen times as a really popular one nowadays. Denied access is a major function that causes tantrums, but if we can highlight that that's what it is, we can run through what is functional communication that I need them to do to request this appropriately. How do I facilitate transitions easier for them so it doesn't always result in these meltdowns? So when a parent really gets the function and really gets how to respond to these behaviors appropriately, that's when we really start to see the change in the kids' lives.
Yes, it sounds to me a little bit part like maybe a big part of ABA is also helping parents understand how to work with their kid.
Yeah, and I always tell parents, you're the lifetime teacher. ABA is always a temporary service for a few years, maybe up to 5 years or so, depending on the child. But the parent is the lifetime teacher who's with them the bulk of the day through the rest of their life. So we always include parent training and have them be involved in understanding of what we're doing.
Glad to hear that. Well, so let's talk about kids between ages of 3 and 10, right? So, a kid who's 3, any kid is going to have trouble communicating. But I think probably in the early years, especially for kids with autism, a lot of frustration comes from the communication barriers. So, when a young autistic child is struggling to express their needs, how do we move beyond just telling them to use your words?
Yeah, and you tell a child who's frustrated just the same thing over and over, it's not going to make anything better for them, obviously. And so a child who already struggles to use their words, you have to meet them at their level. So a child might not be able to communicate in full sentences or even a single word to express what they really need in that moment. But we can provide prompting to them. We can use visual cues and other kinds of supports to help them communicate appropriately. And we kind of prepare for these situations when we know a child has behaviors in these specific triggers. We can prepare them them in role play. We can do transitions. We can have all these supports kind of in place. So when it does happen, everybody, including the child, is more prepared for it. And we can guide them outside of just use your words. We can help them with what to say, use these visual cues and other kinds of prompting to them so that they can get it out more appropriately then and in all those future circumstances.
Wow, and that's a lot. So how does it typically work when you do start working with a child who has trouble communicating or can barely even getting a couple sentences out? What's one of the things that in ABA training that you do or will work with a parent on doing?
Yeah, so we assess what the child's capable of right now. So, can they repeat words back and forth with me? Okay, then that's a sign that they're ready to progress with their verbal language. If that's still a skill that's building or just not there yet, then we find alternate modalities, usually visual supports. AAC devices are so popular and really a great thing with the technology age that has really changed a lot of children's lives because they can just have an iPad that talks for them. So children with those deficits, there's so many different ways we can get them to communicate: pictures, gestures, technology, if they are struggling using their words. But it always starts with those assessments to see where they're at. And then we can always push it because any child can learn to communicate some way, whether it's verbally, whether it's pointing, whether it's using pictures. So we just have to find what they're capable of and really boost up those skills for them.
Wow, that's really, really cool. And it sounds like it's going to be helpful. So, but that's it. Probably take some time, I'm sure. But over time, especially how kids are able to change and grow so quickly at that age, like that's a great hope for a lot of people who are dealing with that type of communication issue. So going on to my next question, I think like part of what I have heard is that some kids have a very rigid routine. I remember like I volunteered and when I was in school, we actually volunteered. I remember we were told that, but we did witness some of that in the child in the school itself in the classroom. So, for instance, like there's some kids who they just want to eat three things, or maybe they hate the tag in their shirt. How can parents support their kids through these really difficult sensory or these rigid sensory challenges without turning everyday life into
Yeah, I mean, sorry, okay. Yeah, I mean, recognizing that uh, they might not get to the exact same level as a neurotypical child, but we can still meet them in the middle and still have them be successful in their environment. We can cut the tag off a shirt and it's not going to impact their day to day life. We can still bring them out into settings with loud noises if they're sensitive to it, and they can just put on some noise canceling headphones or some earbuds to make themselves more comfortable. So we still do desensitization strategies with kids, but still being able to meet them in the middle of making it so it's not so painful or so difficult for them to be in that situation. We can find that middle ground together with them.
yeah. So finding what they need and then helping them get to a comfortable spot. That makes a lot of sense. It sounds to me like what ABA does. It's just a lot of things that just if you think about it in a behavioral type of way, it's just moving from one direction to another direction, and helping the kid or the learner understand or helping the behavior change by giving them aids or tools in a logical step by step pattern. That just seems a little bit more what ABA is. Of course, I'm still very, very new to this. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, once you know the tools and really how to get a child there, like they can get onto that regular track or as close to it as we can get them to be. And, we always see positive outcomes. We always try to push independence. And, pretty much every kid is able to get there if you just know the right tools and what supports are available to them.
Yeah. Well, I think like being a kid just generally is always awkward. Middle school years, oh my gosh. I mean, those were some awkward years. Everyone's like people just changing. In the rules of social life. You're not a kid anymore. Well, you are still a kid, but then things are moving into adulthood, and so those middle school years are always a little bit awkward. And so, like but I can only imagine for a kid with autism, and it's a minefield, probably not just for everyone, but there's these unwritten social rules that can be really exhausting for autistic kids. How do you help them navigate friendships and understand social cues while also honoring exactly who they are?
Yeah. We obviously, as you said, we have embarrassing moments. We have the blunder years ourselves. So for them as well too, we have to just make those unwritten rules and kind of explain them to them. We do a lot of social stories is a really popular thing where we show them videos or kind of role play things out for them. Create little stories about other people navigating these things so they can show that they're not alone in this, and that all so many different kinds of kids go through these same problems, not just those on the spectrum. But to help them specifically, we just had kind those unwritten rules, we can make them written, we can show them, act them out to them. So I spend a lot of time teaching those teens social filtering, what they can say out loud versus what they need to keep to themselves. Social boundaries with other people, because those things are not things we are really taught in school by anybody. So for someone with social skills deficits, they might not understand that when I was a kid, I could pal around more, I could get more physical with my friends and it wasn't a problem. But now, as everyone's growing, now that everybody's starting to look different and act different, I have to change my own ways of being a kid to kind of growing up myself. So we can do that through all kind of social exposure, usually role play with ourselves in the clinic. We can do social groups with peers around that age. We often do like peers groups with teens, and we kind of talk about these things, go out and practice them throughout the week, and then come back the next week and see how we did. And we can kind of deliver feedback to each other. So getting groups of these teens together to kind of talk these things out and see that they are, again, not alone, that other people struggle with it. And we can kind of all problem solve together to figure out the best way to get us all through it. Good enough?
Yeah, sounds like I think like everyone could use that in many ways. Well, I think with another part of being a kid, I remember in middle school, I was definitely fixated on trying to learn to skateboard. I also really loved tennis, and so I knew a lot about the current tennis stars in that era when I was growing up. And I think that kids especially autistic kids, have a very deep special interest sometimes, whether it's trains or a specific video game. How can parents and teachers use these passions as a superpower or a tool for connection rather than just using them or seeing them as a distraction?
Yeah, and I think with these interests, these children and how intense their interests are, it shows how well focused they can be, how strong of a memory they can have, how committed they can be to things that they care about. And some of them can be functional in and of themselves. I have a child who's obsessed with wrestling, and that's led him to going into the gym and working on his fitness as well too. Even if he might not become a wrestler, he has healthy routines that he's building for himself. I have another child who's really interested in the human body and has all these different diagrams and toys for the human body, and he's learning so much about anatomy that he might have a field in he might progress into the medical field into the future, or working in anatomy and physiology in some way. So it really shows that when the kids are really interested in something, they can really focus, they can really learn and show off their intelligence in those ways. And so if we can get them to care and be interested in some of these other things, more academic skills, then we can really see that they can shine if the motivation is there. As well as just, rigidity, kids liking routines is not a bad thing. A lot of fields teach to have strict routines for yourself and discipline. And that's what these kids do in a sense too. They like to have each day having the same kind of routine throughout it. And that's not always such a bad thing, because it shows that they can be disciplined. It shows that they can stick to something day after day, which could eventually be a work schedule. It could be a school schedule. Once they get adapted to these things, then they can really commit to it and navigate the world easier.
Yeah, I mean that sounds awesome. I mean, I think that that's really part of I think any type of middle school experience would be to highlight a positive aspect of this is just for everyone. I think to highlight something positive, and then some small words like that can show what you're capable of, and point that towards a direction in life that can be helpful for them. That makes a lot of sense. So, as kids get older, I think with once you get past middle school, then of course like there's the time where we start really shifting into becoming an adult. And that's the high school years, ages 15 to 18. So this is where we start to learn independence and how to start navigating and looking at ourselves more as an adult than a kid. So I think for any parent, especially for a parent with an autistic child, it's the goal would probably be independence. So I guess like what's the hardest part for a parent when it comes to stepping back and letting their teen build a life skill and self advocacy?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of parents kind of struggle to see the long term there, and they just try to get things done as quickly as possible in the short term, which is them kind of doing everything for their child. A lot of the adults we work with in ABA are lower functioning who didn't get services earlier on for whatever reason. And so we see these parents have been used to doing everything for their child throughout their entire life. And now they're an adult and it's kind of caught up with them where they can't care for themselves, they can't feed themselves, they really aren't able to live by themselves either, just because a parent has kind of gotten used to it being a certain way. So when we come in and work with adults, we always just kind of show the parent that this kid can do some of these things. We really need you to not over prompt. We need to let their hands get dirty, their minds become active in all these skills that we can show them that they can learn. And so once we start to teach an adult these skills in our sessions, we can show it to the parent and say, hey, look what we just did in the span of a couple weeks. This is, all these things are great life skills that he's going to use throughout his entire life. If you can just take some moments to be patient, let him go first, try it himself, and then you correct him afterwards instead of you taking over from start to finish. Those are learning opportunities that we need a parent to buy into if they do want their adult child at this point to have a more independent life. And that is a life where they don't have to be supervised 24/7 and have mom right by their side the entire time.
So that's always like a difficult process for every parent. I think they wanted to, how do you start letting this kid that you known from the age of 0, you literally give life to this child, and then now they're going to start going off on their own. So it's always like a transition for the parent as well as the kid. Yeah. So that's probably a little bit of ABA, sounds to me like helping the parent understand how to help their kid.
Yeah,
Oh,
definitely. It's a huge part of it.
yeah. So I guess like, what's another modern issue that we never really had, especially when I grew up, aging myself, is that we have these screens that are everywhere. And so I know for a lot of kids that these screens are very helpful. They can help regulate, they create a safe space for especially a neurodivergent teen, but getting them off can cause a real massive spike of anxiety or conflict. How do we approach, I guess like the question is, how do we approach screen time battle from a behavioral perspective?
Yeah, so it's always becomes the hardest when it becomes a part of that kid's routine or it becomes habitual for them. So we really encourage parents from the beginning, set the standard of having screen time limits, having other activities available. Sometimes I'll start with the child in the home and we look around and we're like, where's his toys? What does he do? When he's not on the phone, what does he do? And the parent will just say, oh, he's just on the phone. Well, if he doesn't have any other options, then of course he's going to gravitate to the only thing that's there or the most interesting thing that's there. So we really encourage parents to have toys available, especially sensory ones for the kids to use, have opportunities for them to be active as well too, because so many children are, hyperactive on the spectrum or they have so much energy that they need to get out. And so we need to find appropriate ways for them to do it. So, we really encourage parents to get their children into sports, different organized activities like that, where they can get those things out and increase their social opportunities. And at the home, have other things available for them, have arts and crafts, have different kinds of toys for them that they can play with, and have those limits on the screen time because once the kids do become buried in it, that's when it becomes harder to get them out of it. But, when we do always start in those homes sometimes and we'll set limits, we'll do timers where we're going to do play with toys or different kind of activities in between with intermittent breaks where they will get those screens in between. We obviously can't just completely take those things out of a child's life, but we can introduce new interesting things to them while they still get a bit of breaks with that screen time, and we can kind of have one thing take over for another. Because these kids have such wild interests and so many different things that if we just catch them with the right thing, toys, activities, that they'll become hooked on that as well too. So we usually finding a balance of, screen time is great. We can teach a lot of things on there, but we need a child to be active, be interested in their environment around them as well too. So we kind of balance those.
That makes sense. You want to, instead of just completely taking it away, you want to replace it with something else that is also helpful for them in that moment that can, perhaps calm them or whatever else that they need in that moment in time. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So, part of like what I understand, and during my research for this interview is, the field of ABA has evolved a lot, and the older methods have faced some criticism, from what I've read, especially from autistic adults who've gone through that particular training back in the day. I guess my question is, how does modern neurodiversity affirming care focus on supporting a child's unique brain rather than trying to fix them or force them to mask?
Yeah. So as I've kind of mentioned, we find middle grounds in a sense. We want children to express their personalities, their interests in all these ways. We want them to have these interests and be able to express themselves. Just having them be able to act inappropriately in their environment. We want them to still have friends. We want them to still go to college if they're able to. We want them to still have a career. So there's some compromises that need to be made along the way, but we're not going to be by a child and barking at them, that they need to do everything the right way, that we need to change them right now. We understand things take time. We understand that kids are going to be kids, of course, and that neurodivergent kids are still going to be neurodivergent kids to an extent. So we can teach healthy routines while not cutting out the kid or the unique side of each of these kids. They still get playtime. They still get sensory time. They still get breaks to calm themselves, ease their anxiety, because that's what a lot of these quote unquote weird behaviors might be for a kid, is just ways that they express their anxiety. Kids pacing back and forth, kids rocking back and forth, vocal stimming. We can't cut all those things out. We just need sensory replacements for these things sometimes because the kids still have those needs. And if we just say, you can't express yourself, you can't find those sensory needs that you need, you can't put on headphones, you can't, you have to sit in the chair the entire time. We have to find those middle grounds of not trapping them, letting them ease their anxiety, teaching them coping skills, teaching them appropriate ways to meet these sensory needs. And that's really how we avoid, boxing kids into a neurotypical path of where they need to be. So we want them to be themselves. We want them to have all these interests, these sensory needs, but just find more appropriate ways to express these.
That makes perfect sense. And I guess the last question. So this is kind of the big overview question here. So if there's one piece of advice that you can give a parent who has a autistic child, what would it be?
Yeah. So I tell a lot of my parents, just take it one day at a time. It's one day at a time. You pick your battles along the way. You get your supports for yourself and for your child. We encourage a lot of our parents to seek, group parent trainings or groups of parents with autism, seek their own kind of therapy so they can have their own, time away from their children so that their life isn't completely absorbed by their child. We need a healthy parent to have a healthy child. So I always remind them, take it one day at a time, get those supports in place for your child, and just know that things are progressing towards the right track.
That's awesome. Well, Evan, I really appreciate your time with me. And just as a reminder for our viewers, Clear Mind Treatment is starting a new ABA program. And so we'll be seeing children or having learners come in into the program probably starting in beginning of April. And so if you have any questions about ABA or just questions about the program itself or how to begin, etc., just give us a call at 957. And then, yeah, we'll be happy to talk anytime. So thank you so much for joining, Evan. And I am looking forward to anyway, let me try that again. Thank you so much, Evan, for joining us. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Rishi.
All right. Let me go ahead and stop that.